Welcome to the College of Licensed Practical Nurses of Manitoba's Jurisprudence Education module. This education module has been divided into 10 units to make it easier for you to complete the module a unit at a time. This format also gives you the opportunity to pause between units and reflect on the knowledge you have learned. Of course, if you wish, you can complete all 10 units in one sitting. Please note that if you are required to complete the CLPNM's Jurisprudence Education module, that means you are expected to complete all 10 units. This education module has been developed to help student practical nurses, graduate practical nurses, licensed practical nurses, and applicants to the profession increase their knowledge and understanding of the profession, as well as the regulatory framework that guides the profession in the province of Manitoba. This includes information on the legislation, bylaws, practice standards, and guidelines that govern the practice and conduct of practical nurses in Manitoba. As you move along through the units, you may find it useful to have copies of the documents being discussed in front of you. All of the documents referred to in this module are available on the CLPNM's website at www.clpnm.ca. Please feel free to pause this video at any time that you feel it is necessary. Disclaimer. Also be aware that from time to time, the CLPNM will publish new guidance that further elaborates on the professional expectations described in this module. For more detailed guidance and the most up-to-date information, please make sure to visit the CLPNM's website regularly. When you hold registration with the CLPNM, you will be notified when new guidance relevant to your practice and your registration is available. These notices will be sent to you by email. If you are a student practical nurse, graduate practical nurse, or licensed practical nurse, you are required to keep your email address current in our records. Also, please do not unsubscribe from email notifications, as this will result in you missing important information that affects your profession, your registration, and your practice. This unit will provide you with some background information. We will discuss the history of the profession, the responsibilities and authority of the CLPNM, and how the CLPNM as a regulatory body differs from an association or union. We will also review the CLPNM's primary duty to regulate the profession in the public interest, and the regulatory framework that guides and directs practice and conduct of practical nurses. History. Manitoba's LPN profession is over 75 years old and the oldest in Canada. Manitoba's LPNs were the first LPNs in Canada to be designated a regulated profession and the first practical nursing profession in Canada to become autonomous practitioners. The profession is one that is sometimes referred to as a self-regulated profession. Self-regulation means that the government has granted a professional group, in this case practical nurses, the privilege and responsibility to regulate themselves. Essentially, the public contracts with the practical nursing profession to regulate its own members to protect the public from harm that could be caused by LPNs during their practice. When a profession is self-regulated, it means that all members are expected to do their part to contribute to the goals of the profession. All practical nurses contribute to self-regulation when they provide quality nursing care, when they adhere to their professional standards, and when they take part in activities that are aimed at producing better patient outcomes. Self-regulation does not mean that LPNs are the only participants in the regulation of their profession. Like most professions, members of the public also play an important role. We'll talk about this more in later slides. The most recent amendment to the Licensed Practical Nurses Act in 2001 granted LPNs autonomous practice status, meaning Manitoba LPNs were no longer required to work under the direction of another healthcare provider. The 2001 amendments to the LPN Act also included a name change from the Manitoba Association of Licensed Practical Nurses to the College of Licensed Practical Nurses of Manitoba. This name change more clearly identified the function of the organization as a regulatory body without any functions of a professional association. The differences between the functions of regulatory colleges, professional associations, and unions will be discussed later in this unit. The CLPNM is governed by a board of directors which is comprised of 7 LPNs, one of which is president of the board. and there are also 5 public representatives. LPNs are elected to the board of directors by their peers. Participating in an election and serving on the board are examples of ways that LPNs can participate in the self-regulation of their profession. The profession-specific knowledge of LPNs on the board is an important ingredient in the board's ability to make decisions that are in the public interest. For example, when the board reviews and approves new practice guidance, the LPNs on the board can contribute their nursing knowledge and understanding of the practice context. LPNs who serve on the board are, of course, also individuals who bring a broader range of competencies than just their nursing knowledge. For example, some have financial management, human resource, or education backgrounds that help to round out the board's collective competencies. The competencies of LPN board members are complemented by that of the public representatives who contribute unique perspectives, including that of healthcare consumer. The board of directors has many roles. It monitors the financial health of the organization, sets fees, appoints investigators, practice auditors, and committee members. The board also approves documents that direct the practice registrants. The board acts as an appeal body for registration decisions and decisions of the investigation committee. They also approve practical nursing education programs in Manitoba. And finally, they generally monitor to ensure that the organization is fulfilling its mandate of regulating the profession in a manner that serves and protects the public interest. The board of directors is supported by several committees, noted here. The Education Approval Committee, for example, performs a more detailed review of practical nursing programs on the board's behalf and offers recommendations. The Governance Committee does a more in-depth review of the organization's financial health, again offering its recommendations to the board. The work of the CLPNM is directed by the CLPNM's Executive Director and carried out by a complement of staff, including nurses and other professionals. Regulatory colleges, associations, and unions all play important roles in the healthcare professions. Each performs a different function that works towards protecting and supporting the profession, the healthcare professional, and the public. The College of Licensed Practical Nurses of Manitoba is the regulatory college for licensed practical nurses in Manitoba. The Association of Regulated Nurses of Manitoba is the association for nurses in the province. The Manitoba Nurses Union is the union for most of Manitoba's nurses. Please review this table that outlines the distinct differences between the functions of a regulator, association, and union. The public has entrusted the College of Licensed Practical Nurses of Manitoba, via the Licensed Practical Nurses Act, to regulate the profession of practical nursing in Manitoba to serve and protect the public interest. This includes establishing standards of education, evaluating, and monitoring practical nursing education programs, establishing requirements for entry into the profession, establishing the mechanisms, conditions, and requirements for registration, maintaining registers of those allowed to practice the profession, promoting and monitoring continuing competence, overseeing the practice and conduct of practical nurses and intervening when necessary to protect the public, and for developing resources such as the professional standards and codes to guide members of the profession and to hold them accountable. This regulatory framework comprises a range of governing documents that direct and guide the practice and conduct of Manitoba's practical nurses. This image represents the authority of these documents in descending order. This framework demonstrates how key legislation, regulation, standards of practice, bylaws, and other CLPNM documents that guide and direct LPN practice. These documents define rules and authority for the CLPNM as a regulator, as well as the requirements and obligations that applicants to and members of the profession must meet. We will discuss each component of the regulatory framework in more detail as we move through the units in this learning module. Through the LPN Act, the CLPNM is accountable for regulating the profession to protect the public interest, with the goal of ensuring safe, competent, compassionate, and ethical nursing practice. The Act describes the qualifications and other criteria that applicants to the profession must meet before they are eligible for registration with the CLPNM and eligible to use the protected title of Licensed Practical Nurse, or LPN. These criteria include having achieved the nursing competencies required for entry into the profession through acceptable nursing education, demonstrating evidence of past ethical conduct by not having a professional discipline history, a criminal record, or a record on an abuse registry that would make it contrary for the public interest for the applicant to practice the profession. Criteria for registration, such as these, help ensure that the public is protected and help the public have confidence that the LPN at their bedside has achieved the level of nursing competence required for practice and is held to a set of professional standards. The Act also establishes a duty for members of the profession to report to the CLPNM when they believe another member of the profession is suffering from a physical or mental condition or disorder of a nature or to an extent that the member is unfit to continue practicing. This includes a duty to report another registrant who has a substance use disorder that is affecting their nursing practice. The Act also described activities that are considered offenses under the legislation. Offenses include practicing without a valid registration, which is referred to as unauthorized practice, and, if you are an employer, permitting another person to practice in your employment without valid registration or outside of the conditions imposed on their registration. The Act also establishes a duty for employers to report to the CLPNM anytime they terminate the employment of an LPN for reasons of misconduct, incompetence, or incapacity. The profession's scope of practice is also set out in the Act, and it is described on a later slide. The Licensed Practical Nurse Regulation is a type of law improved by the Lieutenant Governor in Council and Cabinet of the Manitoba Government. The regulation elaborates on the requirements introduced in the LPN Act by setting out more detailed requirements for practical nursing education, registration, renewal, and continuing competence. For example, the LPN regulation establishes many of the detailed requirements for registration, such as the requirements for LPNs to submit criminal record checks and to hold liability insurance. The LPN regulation also sets the number of hours that every LPN must practice to maintain their competence and qualify to renew their registration. Specifically, LPNs must practice at least 1,000 hours in every 4-year period. If an LPN does not practice this number of hours, they are deemed to be at risk for losing their competence. They will be able to return to the profession after completing an assessment of their competence and remedial education if required. As of the recording of this module, the CLPNM is preparing for the LPN profession to transition to governance under the Regulated Health Professions Act, or RHPA. The RHPA changes the way health professions in Manitoba are regulated. It will replace more than 20 statutes and bring all regulated health professions under one umbrella act. The RHPA sets out consistent rules and processes for governance, registration, complaints and discipline, and regulation and bylaw making authority. Each profession-specific statute will be repealed when the profession is transitioned to the RHPA. Professional self-regulation will continue under the RHPA, and each profession will have a college, regulations, a code of ethics, and standards to govern its members. The RHPA sets out a new way of regulating who does what in the provision of health services based on the concept of controlling specific healthcare services or procedures. These healthcare services or procedures, known as reserved acts, are performed when providing healthcare by competent healthcare professionals. The health professional must have the appropriate knowledge, competence, and skills necessary to perform the act safely. There are 21 categories of reserved acts, including such activities as ordering screening and diagnostic tests, making a diagnosis, and prescribing, dispensing, or administering drugs, among others. Profession-specific regulations under the RHPA will set out what specific reserved acts a profession can perform and any limits or conditions on the performance of these acts. Under the RHPA, reserved acts are not exclusive to any one health profession, and they are intended to encourage interprofessional practice. Specific to nursing, this means that once all three colleges have completed the transition to the RHPA, there may be nursing interventions that all three nursing professions in Manitoba are authorized to perform. In contrast, there may also be nursing interventions that only one nursing profession is authorized to perform. The RHPA does not yet apply to LPNs. Practical nursing in Manitoba will continue to be governed by the Licensed Practical Nurses Act and its regulation until they are replaced by the RHPA. The term scope of practice refers to the outer range of activities that members of a regulated profession are educated and legally authorized to provide. The legal authority for the practical nursing profession's scope of practice is found in the Manitoba Licensed Practical Nurses Act. While the scope of practice statement appears broad, be aware that the practice of the profession is guided always by the standards of practice and conduct, the code of ethics, competency documents, and the practice directions. All beginning practitioners will demonstrate the entry-level competencies of the profession, which are set out in the Entry-Level Competencies for Licensed Practical Nurses in Manitoba document revised in 2021. Beyond those, the competencies of each individual LPN will fall within the outer boundaries of the profession's scope of practice and will vary based on the individual nurse's post-basic education and training and experience. Competency documents will be further explained in Unit 9. The LPN Act provides the CLPNM Board of Directors with the authority to make binding rules, referred to as bylaws, on certain topics. Most of the bylaws describe governance requirements, while some of them establish rights and obligations for applicants and registrants. These bylaws help govern the CLPNM's registrants effectively. For example, the bylaws establish 30 days as the timeline for responding to CLPNM correspondence, unless a shorter time frame is specified. The bylaws also specify that registrants must notify the CLPNM whenever there is a change in their name, contact information, or employer. Registrants must also keep a current email address on file with the CLPNM. This rule helps to ensure that registrants receive notice of new information that has an impact on their practice or registration. The bylaws also expand on the rule in the CLPNM Licensed Practical Nurses Regulation to report criminal convictions to the CLPNM. Specifically, the bylaws require that registrants also disclose to the CLPNM when they are under investigation or have been charged with a criminal offense, even if not convicted, and if they are under investigation or have been charged or convicted under any statute for an act that relates to impaired driving, bodily injury, or death. When a registrant discloses this information, the CLPNM will not assume that they are guilty of the offense before convicted. Instead, disclosing this information ensures that the CLPNM, as the professional regulatory body, is aware of the allegation which may have a bearing on the registrant's ethics or capacity for safe practice. This disclosure then provides the CLPNM the opportunity to do its own assessment. It is rare for a CLPNM registrant to be under investigation, charged with, or convicted of an offense. However, when this does happen, and when the registrant discloses information proactively and shows insight about the incident, the CLPNM may determine that ongoing authorization to practice does not place the public at risk. The full circumstances of each individual case will be considered, and each case may result in a different outcome. The standards of practice and conduct are authoritative statements that define professional expectations for practical nurses in Manitoba. The primary purpose of the standards is to direct safe, ethical, and clinically competent practical nursing practice and professional conduct. The standards also provide the benchmark against which practical nurses are measured. They describe what members of the public can expect from practical nurses in our province. In this way, the standards establish the foundation for a relationship of trust between the public and the profession. The standards are applicable to all practical nurses in all settings in which they practice in Manitoba, including clinical practice, research, education, and administration. The standards apply to all CLPNM registrants, including licensed practical nurses, graduate practical nurses, and student practical nurses. Student practical nurses are introduced to the standards over the course of their entry to practice practical nursing programs. There are 66 standards of practice and conduct, which are organized into 7 categories, but it is important to note that there is overlap between them. For example, by adopting a client-centered approach to care, the LPN is also contributing to a collaborative care approach while demonstrating professional accountability and leadership. For this reason, all the standards should be reviewed and understood in context with one another. Over the next 7 units, we'll take a closer look at the standards in each of these categories before moving on to reviewing the Code of Ethics, Practice Directions, and other CLPNM guidance documents. Now that you understand the duties and functions of the CLPNM and have a general understanding of the regulatory framework for Manitoba's practical nurses, move on to the next unit to learn more about your standards related to professional accountability. If you have any questions about this unit, or if you have any other questions about practical nursing practice, please contact the CLPNM for more information.